Back here in studio, we're now joined by Alex Kohut, the founder of North Pole Strategies. In a past life, worked in the Trudeau PMO, Trudeau the Younger, I guess I should say, on advertising and research. Alex, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so listen, it's interesting to have you here because you did polling on this NDP leadership race right at the very beginning. And months later, people are saying that we don't know if this is going to bear out when the final vote comes through, but people are saying that this race looks to be Avi Lewis's to lose. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most likely outcome at this point. It's interesting. I did my research back in November at the very start of the race, and my takeaway at the time was that it was a very open race. No one had more than 20% support from people who were open to voting NDP. And there was a lot of people saying, no, I don't know yet, I don't know these people. Awareness of all the candidates was low, even among people who were pretty ardent supporters of the party. So we saw an opportunity for this race to be about who can grow their support and who can introduce themselves the best way to Canadians, to NDP voters, and who could actually mobilize their support, sign up the most people, get the most donations. At this point, it looks like the person who has managed to do that is probably Avi Lewis. We have to be cautious about this. There's only so much data that's available for leadership races, and we have to be a little careful. But the main thing that we found is predictive in past leadership races is usually donations. And if you look at the donation numbers that have been released so far, Avi Lewis has raised about half of all the money that's been raised in the leadership race. And if you look at the total number of donors, more people have donated to Avi Lewis than to all of the other candidates combined, which really puts him in the driver's seat here. I also think that if you look at the regional numbers, I'm not in the prediction business, but if I was, I would be much more confident if this was similar to the Liberal or the Conservative race where it's weighted by riding, because I think Avi Lewis clearly has the most donations and probably the most support in British Columbia, in Ontario, in Quebec. Atlantic Canada and the North probably don't have a lot of members, but he might have the advantage there too. But it's really, looking at Alberta especially, but also Saskatchewan, where McPherson, we should expect to have a big advantage there. If it was weighted by riding, that wouldn't be enough to win or to even force a second ballot probably. But it's one member, one vote. So we could see a situation where the Alberta NDP is pretty motivated. Avi Lewis has a position on oil and gas that is very different from what a lot of people in Alberta think about. So if there has been enough mobilization there, potentially that could outweigh the memberships across the rest of the country. I just think it looks, the math doesn't really add up for Alberta to outweigh the rest of the country here. So I think most likely we're seeing an Avi Lewis victory. I'm not sure if it would be on a first ballot or not.
Yeah, and really at the end of the day, we're not going to know for a while, because when they announce the leader tomorrow, we've been told by the party that they're just going to announce the leader. They're not going to walk us step by step of this preferential ballot. But what's also interesting is that despite this leadership race that has gone on for months now, and despite a number of debates that were broadcast, interviews that were given, polling also shows us that Canadians are not really aware of the candidates and who is running to lead the NDP. How problematic is that for a party that's trying to rebuild its relevance and profile in this country?
Yeah, that was definitely the case at the start of the race. If you look at the polling recently, Angus Reid and others, definitely the case still that people just don't know who these are. My polling found more people knew about Zoran Mamdani than knew about the frontrunners in the NDP race. People are kind of taking from him in their leadership campaigns, and you can see that's probably why. But they need to be able to establish their own brand. That being said, right now we have a new leader, whoever it's going to be, is a bit of a blank slate for Canadians. That's not the worst case scenario. You would rather have a blank slate than someone who no one knows. There is, again, that opportunity to grow. It just means that a lot of effort is going to have to be put into introducing whoever wins in national media across the country with audiences that aren't just the base of the party. So I think, hopefully, ideally, we're going to see whoever wins quickly do some media in Quebec, do some media in Ontario, really put themselves out there. Maybe if they don't have a seat in the House of Commons, try to get that seat so they can be a bit more in the conversation day to day. But ultimately, it's going to take a little bit of time for Canadians to get to know the new NDP leader, and they're going to have to do a pretty concerted branding strategy to try to make sure that they are putting their best face forward as Canadians get to know who they are.
Laurie, you were nodding your head through a lot of that, in particular when Alex was talking about the front-runner status that Avi Lewis seems to have right now going into that vote tomorrow. What kind of insight, what trends have you been following as you have been tracking this race since November?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you look at, like, it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen in these things, and I think, as far as I know, this is the first time that the party has used a preferential ballot. So when Jagmeet Singh was elected, he did manage to get it on the first ballot, so you didn't see the subsequent rounds. But in the event that that didn't happen, it would have been lower, least popular candidate dropped off. Then they do a whole fresh vote. And we won't see that, right? And I would suspect
Which we did see in the Thomas Mulcair when he became leader of the NDP.
Yeah, so there was that sense of that really kind of old-fashioned convention style, the dramatic, when someone's dropped off, then everybody reallocates, and then people can decide who else they're going to support. And so there's that sense in the party of the breaking up of the party around the different candidates, and then the coming back together as they start to decide, okay, we're all going to line up behind the person who ultimately wins. With Jagmeet Singh, that didn't need to happen. In this case, it has been such a low-profile process, right? That if Avi Lewis ends up coming through and winning this thing, which I think looks like the likely outcome, is there going to be a lot of rebuilding required? Maybe not so much, right? Maybe not, because it hasn't come down to this fierce battle between two front runners kind of thing. There's another front runner, but it just really seems like he's been far and away the person who's most likely to take it. Personally, I think the fact that he doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons is a challenge. I know that, so I think it was Mr. Bulleris who made the point, Don Davies made the point about how Mark Carney didn't have a seat right away. Right, but he got one within like 7 or 8 weeks, right? So like, it's hard to be the person on the outside looking in, right, as the others are talking about the big issues. I think in terms of people not having the kind of familiarity with the candidates, whoever wins is going to have, I think, a kind of internal and external strategy at the same time. Fortunately, I don't think there's an election around the corner, so the party will have time to do that. They're going to have to get their name out there. They're going to have to build that familiarity with voters, but at the same time, they have to get the house in order financially, in terms of deciding what that new brand of the party is going to be as well, or else it's going to be much harder for them to attract positive attention to themselves, knowing that they're on wobbly foundation.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned not having a seat in the House of Commons, but when it comes to Avi Lewis, he also has twice tried to get into the House of Commons,
100%.
has twice lost in that effort, coming not second, but third in both those races. No experience on how to navigate what happens in committee, how you negotiate questions in the House of Commons. How much of a disadvantage will that be if he is the one who actually wins the leadership tomorrow?
I think it's significant, honestly. I mean, on the one hand, they don't have party status, so I don't mean to sound like I'm piling on here, but they don't have party status. They're not on committees anyway, and so he will have an opportunity, I guess, to build up some familiarity with those kinds of things. But going back to another issue, if it is the case that, for example, Mr. Bulleris decides to step away to run for a seat at the provincial level in Quebec, they're losing significant institutional memory in the party, and a sense that there are people who have been around the block a lot. They were here in the good old days when there was lots of seats for the party, and that could be really fortifying for a party that's trying to find its feet again. And so the sense in which maybe the project is going to be largely up to the new leader, that makes it, I think, more daunting.
Yeah, let me pick up on that point, because of course Marc-André spoke with Alexandre Bulleris not that long ago, tried to get to whether or not he's staying or going. Mm-hmm. If he does decide to go, which seems to be where this is leading to, leaving federal politics to join Quebec Solidaire on the provincial level, if that happens, Laurie talks about the institutional knowledge. Build on that, Alex. How bad would that be for the NDP?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most kind of under-talked about issues that's facing the NDP leaving this leadership race. If we end up in a situation where Bulleris steps down in the next couple of weeks, NDP not only will not have a seat in Quebec, and Bulleris has been carrying the NDP brand in Quebec, but there is no provincial NDP party. It's been his voice that's been very active in Quebec media that's been keeping the NDP brand alive there. But actually, we wouldn't have a single NDP MP east of Winnipeg. It would be the first time in a long, long time that there's no NDP MPs in Ontario, in Quebec, in Atlantic Canada. And that's a struggle, especially if there is a majority government soon, if we're looking at not until 2028 or 2029, the next election happening. Realistically, we could have a few years where there just isn't anyone local on the ground for the NDP in these communities. There isn't that infrastructure being rebuilt there. There isn't that constant efforts to bring the voices of those areas into caucus. It's a real challenge. I think the next leader needs to be very vocal, very quick to reach out to the provincial parties in those areas, to reach out to stakeholders in those areas, to say, how can we support you? How can we build up the parties here? And in Avi Lewis's case, if there's a seat that becomes available for a by-election in Ontario, in Quebec, I think he almost has to run for it. Because an NDP that has one seat in Ontario is a lot more competitive as a national force than an NDP that has 0 seats in Ontario. And if he is saying no to those opportunities, he's kind of sending a message that Ontario isn't the priority, or that Quebec isn't the priority. So I think it puts him in a difficult position. That being said, even if he runs for a seat in Ontario, he does okay, he comes second, that's still a chance to be in the media. It's still not disqualifying by any means. He still will have other opportunities. But I think he just needs to find ways to insert himself into the provincial conversations in other parts of the country, and that would be a great way to do it. So it's another reason for him to jump on the first opportunity he gets to do that.
Yeah, we're quickly running out of time, but before we're done, Alex, I want to put it to you, though, because if Alexandre Boulris leaves, if the NDP is reduced to a Western rump, to me, it seems to almost highlight the challenge that if it is Avi Lewis, will have before him, because he's speaking so much against oil and gas, and yet when you look at the NDP in the West, how does one, forget about being a pan-national or pan-Canadian party, how do you resolve ideologically that divide if it is he that wins the leadership tomorrow?
Yeah, it'd be really challenging, because the reality is the NDP is stuck in kind of a middle spot where there's a lot of much more positive scenarios that are on the table for them, but things can go in the other direction as well. I think Avi Lewis as a leader has a lot of risk reward there. He has some connections to Eastern Canada. He has some connections in Montreal and Ontario. He has a message that is loud and people take notice of it. He's a pretty charismatic guy, so he has that opportunity to catch fire. But if you look at where the NDP base is right now in BC, and especially in Alberta, where a lot of the infrastructure is for the party right now, he's looking at potentially a civil war within the party that could resolve in a pretty damaging way in the short term. So, if he's the leader, my first phone call would be to some of the leaders of the Alberta NDP to say, hey, how can we find some common ground? How can we keep this party united? How can we continue to work for both of us to succeed, even if we don't have the same policy positions on every topic?
And if that phone call happens, we invite them to invite us to listen in. Laura, you're going to stay. We'll speak a bit. But Alex, Kohut, thank you for this. North Pole Strategies, thank you for the time today.
Happy to do it.